And that you touched on earlier, and you said something that I was going to pick up on and never did, about your mother and her you said that she was angry at a certain point, and this is when we were talking about tea and that. Can you elaborate on the influence of your mum, because I know that she was important, and has been important to some of your projects and things. But
Yes. Well, I did talk at length about her
yeah,
and Sarah in another context at the beginning, but in relation to empire, she was, I mean, the interesting thing was you had this empire going on, and most of the people, down to my grandparents' age, never really questioned it. I mean, basically, they saw things that were wrong with it and it could be done better and so on. But it was basically good. I mean, these people were needing it. They were still school children. They were in trust, and so the British, on the whole, were a good influence. Look at other empires, or look at what they were like before we came, or whatever. So in order maybe to survive, you had to believe in the imperial project. My mother was brought up in that. I mean, she was 22, 23 or 24 when the India gained independence, 25. And so that part of her life was lived within it. But the next 20 years, or a little less, yes, 20 years, she was after independence. And so she began to distance herself. She describes this quite often in interviews and elsewhere. And she wrote a very good book called Daughters of the Empire, which documents her feelings about this, which describes her great-grandmother and then her grandmother and her mother and herself, and ends up with her own anger, because she was right up against all the things which people criticize about it. She saw the poverty above all, the horrific conditions, particularly in Calcutta, but even on the tea plantations, the lack of amenities and so on and so on. So she helped to start schools, helped to start medical support, tried to bring in family planning. She learned Assamese. She tried to do a little bit on a tea plantation against all the other Mem Sabs and even against her husband's career, because it was dangerous to get too involved in this kind of thing. But she was one of the few people who the Indians there would actually say, you seem to be interested in us. You've learnt our language. You're excavating our old tombs and things, and you want to know about us. So she would, go and have a meal in an poor Indian's house and so on. And so she began to get under the surface, and she describes how sort of the scales fell away from her. She becoming an anthropologist. She was seeing that these people are complex and have rich and interesting lives, and are not inferior in any way to us. It just happens that they have been born in a different household to us. And this alternately made her curious and helped her survive being a tea planter's wife, which with all the dreary drudgery of, club life and so on, but also made her angry because she could see, the difference between the kind of life she led in a Barasab's bungalow with 20 servants and, cars and this and so on, and the people who were sweeping the floors around her. And so she felt, as Kipling to a certain extent had felt, not angry, but wanting to show. So she wrote several books. One of the angry ones was about the Black Hole of Calcutta, in which she looked at it and it showed that a lot of it had been made up by the British. It couldn't have happened. It was based on a tiny incident, and they blew it up into a provocation which would give them justification for having another war and taking over another part of India. So it was a myth. And so she was part of the anti-imperial. Now she was socialistic. She believed, she voted Labour. She was a Buddhist later in her life. So she reacted against monotheism as well as upper middle class conventions. But even she never entirely escaped it. I mean, there were times when she was sick and so on, when we saw that the whole sort of attitude towards Indians and so on was so deep in her that she couldn't entirely escape treating them as servants, as it were. And, you know, it's probably true of my generation too. There are moments when you find yourself thinking in these terms, as we've discussed with racism before. But that's why she was angry, because above all, she couldn't do anything. You know, the treatment of animals particularly upset her, and treatment of dogs and so on. And so she wanted to do something, but both as a woman, as the wife of a tea planter within the empire, she was frustrated and frustrated. And it's the sort of frustration you even get in undertones in the Armed Forces passage to India, a sort of bewilderment, confusion, anger, and wanting to do something.